Let's get started. What's a form? It's a structured way of getting information from a user. You probably recognize this. There for the sake of the computer. A form is also supposed to provide a good user. So every component of a form, what input controls you use, the help text, validation that makes sure that the user is entering the right thing, all these can give them clues to help them successfully fill out the form. Good example of this is TurboTax software for filling out your taxes. It doesn't but before we do that, let's make sure we're on the same page about how the web works at a basic level and what's happening when you submit a form. So let's talk about HTTP. The browser splits it up, takes the domain, connects to that server, takes the second part, it calls it the path, and then makes this request to the server with the path. So /news, the server is responsible, whatever software is running there, to figure out does news exist, and if so, to return it, or if not, to return an error. You can get more complicated queries that include what's called a query string. Has other verbs, but the only one that's really used aside from get is post. And post is most often what's going to be happening when a form is submitted. Post indicates that the request is not just retrieving something from the server, but it's supposed to make a change to the server, or that's expected. Have you ever been using your browser and submitted a form and then hit reload? And it gives you a pop-up dialog that says, are you sure you want to do this? You already did it. It's doing that because it's a post request, and the browser knows that it's got a chance of making a change on the server and wants to make sure that you really want to do that more than once. This is an example of a post request to a Plone site, to the registration form. Okay, so we've got this thing showing up in somebody's browser, but now we got to do something when it actually submits to the newsletter sign-up URL. So we're going to get into some code. It's pretty basic. I'm going to walk you through it. This is a turned into a Python dictionary, so we can look them up by name. If it finds form submitted, it knows the button was pressed. And then we wouldn't detect that they had actually submitted the form on the server side. So using this hidden variable is a very common ZOP pattern for figuring out when the form needs to be processed. So let's take this a step further. If I'm entering email addresses, we probably don't want to accept input that's not an email address, right? So what do we need to do? We need to do validation. And validation is just checking the inputs to make sure that they're in the proper format and that everything that's there is supposed to be there. So in our example here, we do this inside, only if the form was actually submitted. And here I'm just checking, is email in self.request.form? If so, fine. If not, then we add it to a list of errors. I didn't quite complete this. Here I'm saying if there weren't any errors, then we do our processing of the email. You can ignore the else statement here. Sorry about that. In real life, we'd also, of course, want to check that it actually is an email address and not just some random string of characters that the user typed in. But for the sake of the example, I didn't. I would probably use a regular expression and check that, or I would try to find a library that had an email validation already. So we've got this list of errors, right? And we actually want to show the user the error so they know what they did wrong. So here you can see where I am calling the template down at the bottom. I'm passing in errors. And then let's look at the change to the template. So this is now not just raw HTML. I'm now using TAL here, which is ZOP's templating language. And I'm checking if there are errors, it's going to build this unordered list. And it's going to loop over the errors, which since they were passed in the template the way they were, show up in options/errors. So we just loop over all of those and make a new list item for each one. Again, in real life, probably we would want to show the error next to the field that caused that error. And so to do that, we would have to, instead of just making a list of errors, we would have a Python dictionary where the key was the field name and the value was the errors for that field, and then we would have to have a snippet like this before each field in the template to see were there any errors and should I show them. There's one more missing piece, which is, say I submit that form and I didn't put it in my email address, right? So it's going to figure out that it was missing, it's going to add this error, and it's going to show the form again. It's not, actually that's a bad example. Say that I had the full validation that it actually is an email address, and I type in something that's not an email address. I submit the form, it comes back. It's not actually going to have what I typed in that field so I can see it and fix it. It's just going to be empty. And the reason for that is that right now our email input here doesn't specify a value, and the browser is just going to default to making it be empty. So to fix that, we have to add a feature called postback, and postback is just making sure that whatever you submitted last time is going to actually get rendered for the user again. And that's really important, right? Because usually you only have an error in one field, and you don't want the user to have to enter in all the other fields again. So this is pretty easy to add. I do a tell attributes to set the value attribute, and I'm setting it to request form email, which is, the emails should be in the request if it was submitted before. The pipe nothing just says if there's a problem getting that, don't break entirely. So that should make sure that the email address that I typed in and submitted is going to show up again if the form fails validation and gets rendered again. So right now we've got pretty good error handling for this form. There's one more thing we need to do, which is that you actually need to do the right thing when it succeeds after we do the sign up for the email newsletter. And usually what we want to do is we want to redirect the user somewhere else, right? We want to take them to some page that says thank you or something like that. And part of the reason that we do this is so that, if we didn't do this, they would just still see the form. They might not realize that it had actually done anything. And so they might hit refresh and it might sign them up again, and that sort of thing. So this gives the user some feedback, and it also makes sure that if they reload, then it's not going to do anything more. It's just going to be re-showing that thank you page that is not a form itself. So that is basic example of building a form, building a browser view that handles a form without actually using any of the fancy form libraries in Zope. I do want to talk about those libraries because there are cases when they're useful. It's a common thing for developers when we've written a few forms like this, we start to think, oh, well, I keep doing the same thing over and over again, and I don't like that, and I feel like I could probably create something that would make it easier for me to do this. And Larry Wall said the virtues of a programmer are laziness, impatience, and hubris. Because those are all the things that make you think that I can do it better and I can create my own thing that will make things easier. And to some extent, that's true. And certainly, we have ended up with a lot of form libraries to choose from in the Plone ecosystem. Here are a few of them. I'm going to talk a little bit about these. I'm not going to get into a lot of detail. I'm going to try to give sort of a high-level overview of sort of what the strengths and weaknesses of them are. I'm going to cover them roughly in chronological order of when they were most used in Plone. And some of them are not necessarily, have necessarily ever been used a lot in Plone core. Wait for the end, because I'm going to give you a recommendation of which of these you should actually pay attention to, and it's not all of them. So don't worry too much if you aren't following all the details as I go through. The sorts of things that these libraries take care of are the same sorts of things that I was showing you step by step in the basic example. It's getting the HTML of the form rendered. It's validating input. It's executing actions when buttons are pressed, those sorts of things. And just providing a way to do that with less work for the developer. So, Zope, when it first came along, people would just do things the way I was showing you, and you would have a template that had the form, and you'd have a script that would do something when the form was submitted, and the form action would just point it to the script when you submitted the form. Then came CMF Form Controller, and CMF Form Controller is sort of a way of having a flow between your templates and your scripts that is easier to adjust and override parts of. So CMF Form Controller, if you look around in the Plone code base, you'll see these files that are .cpt, .cpy, .vpy, and those are all form controller things. CPT is templates, CPY is scripts, VPY is also scripts of a special sort. It's validator scripts. And with Form Controller, each of these files had the same file name .metadata, and that metadata file had some other configuration of how these things were attached together. So the metadata file for the template would say, when this thing gets submitted, it's gonna run these validators, and it would list the name of some of the validator scripts, and then it would say it's either gonna succeed or fail. If it succeeds, redirect to this other place. If it fails, render the same template again, that sort of thing. So it was sort of making it possible to, a little bit more possible to reuse some of these components, because you could write, the validator script for an email once, and then you could reference it from these different forms, that sort of thing. An advantage of CMF Form Controller is it's very hackable through the web. You don't have to have a Python package set up. This was back in the through the web Zope days. But the corresponding disadvantage to that is that it's not real Python, it's restricted Python, and that means that tooling is hard. You can't use your normal debugger on it. You can't put your code in version control the same way. Nothing quite works like Python developers want it to. Another advantage to it is that it doesn't have any implications for how your forms look. It doesn't generate any HTML for you like some of the other libraries are going to do, which means you write it yourself. You have full control over where everything appears and how they look. The disadvantage to that, of course, is that it doesn't help you out with the most tedious part of building a form. So for those reasons, CMF Form Controller, there's still a number of things in Plone core that are written using it, but we're working to move away from that. And I think it's been kind of years since anybody has really been writing new stuff for Plone core with CMF Form Controller. I'm not, maybe people are in their projects and stuff, but it's less common. So some concepts I'll go over quickly that are relevant here. Validators, this notion of encapsulating a particular type of check into a component that you can reuse, such as the email validator. Something that might be for one particular field's input, or it might be a check on the form as a whole, like saying, if I've got two password fields, are they the same? That sort of thing. And the concept of actions, which is just some code that does something when the form is submitted, usually connected to a particular button on the form. The next library I'm going to talk about is Archetypes. Archetypes isn't exactly a different form library from CMF Form Controller. It uses CMF Form Controller. But what it adds is the concept of a schema. And a schema is sort of a list of the fields that are going to appear in the form. And along with that, the ability to automatically generate the HTML for the form from the schema. So it knows there's this text field and that Boolean field, and it's able to generate an HTML text input and some radio buttons or whatever. And Archetypes just has a standard edit template and a standard view template for an Archetypes content type. And then those are CMF Form Controller things. And they look at the schema and loop over the fields and spit out the HTML for each one. This is an example of what the schema looks like for one particular field. It's the text field that makes up the body of a page in Plone. And you can see it's got some of the same things, same concepts we were talking about. It lists a validator. It also has things that are not necessarily related to forms, like is this field searchable in the Zope catalog? Where is it stored in the database and that sort of thing. So the schema in Archetypes has a lot of things in it, and only some of them are relevant to form generation. Archetypes is nice because there's a good balance between being able to reuse things and still having the flexibility to make a particular thing look, be unique. The cons are there's a little bit too much magic in it, and if people who were around 5 years ago and doing lots of development with Archetypes probably remember sort of struggling to figure out like where is this thing coming from and what's it doing. Another big con with Archetypes is that it was built first as a content type system as opposed to a form library, which means that you couldn't have a standalone form like our email newsletter sign up that just did some arbitrary action. You sort of had to have some content type that the form was attached to, and that just doesn't suit all the use cases. Just to talk a bit more about some of these new concepts introduced by schema-centric form libraries. Fields, each field collects one piece of information. Each field has a type like string or date or multiple choice. When I say a single piece of information, that is a little bit misleading because you could have a field that's a list, and that still only counts as one field even though it's a list of items of the same type. Or you might have a field that's like a geolocation field and it has latitude and longitude as two parts, but it's still just one field. But it's a way of sort of encapsulating some functionality related to one particular type of data that you need to input. And a bunch of fields together form a schema. There's also this idea of a widget, and a widget is the way that a field gets presented in the HTML. Usually, there's a kind of one-to-one mapping between a field and a widget. Like obviously, if you got a date field, you want to have a date picker widget to put things into it. But we have fields and widgets are two separate concepts, though, because there's some cases where like you might have one type of field that has different types of widgets that can work with it. Like if you've got a Boolean field, which is like true, false, as the data that's stored, you might want to present that as a checkbox, so you'd have a checkbox widget for that. Or you might want to present it as radio buttons, yes, no, and so you'd use the radio widget for that. On the other hand, you might have a single widget that's used with multiple types of fields. So like if you've got a checkbox widget, that could be used with the Boolean field, like I said, but it could also be used with the multiple choice field that has a checkbox for each of the possible options. So that's, the field has to do with what type of data is stored. The widget has to do with how is that type of data actually presented to the user in the form. There's a form library called Plone FormGen, which is pretty cool. It was created by Steve McMahon, who is sitting back there. And Plone FormGen is unique because it's a really great tool for non-developers. It's probably the most popular add-on that you can install on your Plone site. And then you just go to Add Menu, Form folder, and you get a user interface that looks like this, where you've got that toolbox on the right, and you can drag your widgets over to build up your form. And then there's advanced settings for if you are a bit of a developer, you can put in a Python expression as a validator for a field, and you can configure different types of actions. It comes with built-in ones to send an email or just save data in a table. There's also some add-ons that'll do other things when you submit your form. There's one that Nathan created when he was at UW to save the form input as an actual content item. And that's a really useful thing in conjunction with the uw.northstar product, which lets you then attach workflow to those things, and you can sort of make a form that actually stores a bunch of things that people submitted and then have some workflow around processing them, all without necessarily writing much code. So I think Plone FormGen is a really great tool for a number of use cases and for a number of people. I think it is not the right choice necessarily if you are a developer and are going to be more comfortable having full control when you're writing Python. Once you sort of reach the limits of Plone FormGen and need to do something special, it could be a lot of extra work to work with the way that Plone FormGen is structured as a developer versus just writing your own form. For example, I wrote a product called collective.megaphone, which is a tool for running advocacy campaigns like a petition or a letter writing campaign. And it uses Plone FormGen, so sets up the fields to collect your address and the message that you want to send to a legislator about some issue. But I created this thing and then I realized, well, really I want to be able to address a list of multiple recipients, different legislators associated with a district or that sort of thing. And the mailer in Plone FormGen was almost but not quite flexible enough to do that. It certainly supported sending things to multiple people, but I needed to substitute in different, like a different first and last name for like the dear so-and-so for each of those recipients. And so I went to a lot of work to create something that would call the normal Plone FormGen mailer multiple times after substituting these things in. And it would have been easier for me to just write a custom form. I realized far too late. There's FormLib. FormLib was in vogue maybe in 2007 and 2008. It was the first form library to be based around ZOP schemas, which if you use Plone for very long, you'll realize are kind of a core concept. More commonly used today than archetype schemas. This example shows you what the ZOP schema looks like for this, having this email field. And then down the bottom, you can see what the form looks like. It says, that there's some form fields that are based on that schema. And then there's this thing in the middle, which is a bit hard to explain, but it's kind of a core concept to FormLib. FormLib is based on around this idea of data storage via adapters. And what that means is that when the form is trying to figure out what data it needs to display or what data it needs to save, it starts with the context of the form, which is like the page that the form is attached to. Like if you've got a URL /news/ the name of this form, the context would be the news item. So it starts there and it says, does that thing support the iSignup interface, which just means does that thing have an email address itself and does it say that it does? If so, great, I can get the email and set the email using that interface. If not, then it looks up an adapter and it'll end up finding the thing in the middle here. The adapter is a separate component that knows how to get and set the email for a particular type of other thing. And this is a really simple one. The adapter gets the context, and then it just is getting and setting the email. It's got a property there that'll get and set the email on the context. All this to say is it's a little bit complicated. It's a little hard to wrap your mind around. For this and other reasons, FormLib didn't really catch on. It caught on enough that we use it in a number of places in Plone, but it sort of had a brief window of time, especially because Z3C Form, which is the next thing I'll talk about, came along, which is more flexible. There were some things that were just hard to do with FormLib. Z3C Form is the modern form library that's probably most used today. It's the thing that Dexterity is based on. Like Archetypes and FormLib, it's based on a schema. But it also, if you look at the example here, in some ways doesn't look that different from how you handle something if you're not using a form library at all. We've got this handle signup method, which is attached to a button here. It says, when the sign up button gets pressed, call this code, essentially. And that is calling self.extract form, which that's where the data validation happens. So it looks at the schema and sees what are the fields, do they have any validators, runs all the validators and collects all the errors together. And then if there were errors, we return, which basically is going to make it, after I return, it's going to re-render the form. So the errors will be shown there. If there weren't any errors, then I do my custom logic to do the sign up, and then I do a redirect just like I would without a form library. I didn't show it, but it's also based on adapters like FormLib. So we would need a similar adapter to the last example. But it also supports plain dictionaries. So you can say this form is editing this dictionary, and then you don't need to write an adapter because it knows how to deal with dictionaries. So that makes things a little bit easier. I would say the biggest pros of Z3C form are that it uses adapters not just for how the data is retrieved and set, but kind of throughout its infrastructure. That makes it complex, but it also means that it's very easy to override particular pieces, and it's very easy to define site-wide policy. I can say, whenever there's a field of this type, I want you to use my custom widget over here instead of the one that you would normally use. You can even say things like, I want it to do that only when I'm editing in the context of this content type or that section of the site or different things. So it's quite flexible. The biggest con is the same thing. It's quite complex and uses this adapter pattern throughout. And the documentation is a little bit weak, especially for people who are diving into the details. It's documentation that's written as both tests and documentation, and that doesn't tend to work out very well usually. But if you are trying to use Z3C form, there are some resources apart from the official Z3C form documentation that will probably be useful. There's a manual on developer.plone.org called the Schema-Driven Forms Manual, which sort of walks through how to use Z3C form to do different things. There's also a lot of examples in the dexterity documentation, since that's based on Z3C form as well. I'm only going to talk briefly about the remaining libraries. Deform is a library that, these are the ones that are sort of unofficial, not actually used anywhere in Plone core. There's a few people in the community maybe who like them, which is why I'm mentioning them. Deform came out of the Pyramid ecosystem, which is another Python web framework. It uses its own schema format called Colander and its own way of getting data to and from the browser. It's encoded in a different way than the parameters I showed you earlier. It's a little bit tricky to use in Plone because it expects a different type of request object than the ZOP request. It needs a WebOb request, but somebody made collective.deform, which makes it possible to get a WebOb request off of the ZOP request. So it's possible to use. And then there's YAFAWIL, which stands for Yet Another Form Widget Library. And this is from guys at the Blue Dynamics Alliance, which are some Plone guys in Austria. And it can be used in Plone with YAFAWIL.plone, but I don't actually know that much about it. I thought it'd be interesting to look at Plone core and how all these libraries have been used in Plone core over time. So this is showing a representative list of packages. These are sort of some of the packages in Plone core that have their own forms. And the horizontal axis is time. So the longest bars are the packages that have been around for the longest because we keep adding things to Plone. And then the color coding is by which form library that package uses the most. So you can see the older stuff tended to be CMF form controller. The newer stuff tends to be Z3C.form. And then there's sort of this time in the middle where some people were using FormLib and some people couldn't figure it out and were just writing stuff from scratch. But there's also, still things that get written from scratch because sometimes that's just a better way to do it. My recommendation for what to use is learn a little bit about Plone FormGen and Z3C Form, enough to be dangerous, and sort of know what are the right situations to use them. And, you know, ask questions when you get stuck, because there's a lot of people who have knowledge about these things and can provide tips about how to deal with something that seems to be harder than it should be. I'll give one example of that. Often, you know, you've got this great Z3C form, you've got your schema, it's all generating and working, great, but then you realize, well, I don't necessarily want all the fields just to be listed one after the other. I want to like have some on the right, some on the left, or something like that. So I need a custom template. And that's actually pretty easy to do. You just set the template equal to a view page template file, which is saying, you know, where to find the custom template. That'll make it use that template instead of the default one. And then in that template, you can actually, it's a little bit long and clunky, but view.widgets is, or view/widgets here is a dictionary of all the widgets. We look up email in that dictionary, and then we call the render widget view, which is going to actually render just that field. So you can put these things wherever you want within the template and put whatever other text you want around them. And this way you still get the benefit of the form library in terms of using its validators, using its fancy widgets, but you don't lose the flexibility of putting things wherever you want in your template. Continuing my recommendation, so you know, learn those tools, but don't try too hard to make them work for you. If you can't figure out you know, how to use the data grid in Z3C Form, maybe it'll be easier for you to just write a browser view and a template that renders a grid and that you know, does the processing yourself. I do want to say a few more things about things to watch out for when you're writing things from scratch. One is a security issue called cross-site request forgery. And this is basically, if I'm, you know, a black hat hacker and I know that you're the administrator of Plone.org, and I know that you're going to visit my site, I can put some code on my site that'll load Plone.org in a hidden iframe, and because you're logged in on Plone.org as the administrator, when your browser loads that iframe, it'll pass along your cookie, which identifies you, and you'll have it'll have full credentials to that site. And my malicious site can, you know, load that iframe on whatever I want. I can load it on, you know, the URL that deletes things or something like that. So this is not so good because you wouldn't even necessarily know that I was doing that. So the common way for preventing this is using what's called a authenticator token. So basically, Zope generates this thing off of your user ID and a secret, and it gets put into a hidden input in the form. And then once the form is submitted, we check for that token and make sure that it's what it's supposed to be. And the reason this helps is because, you know, me, black hat hacker, I can write JavaScript that loads whatever page I want from your site, but browsers have cross-site scripting restrictions, which means that I can't grab the value of that token. I can't actually see in JavaScript what was loaded in that page. So I'm going to be blocked from grabbing the token and then making a post to the right place to submit the form. So this is the pattern for how you would put that authenticator. There's this helper to do that in your template, and then the thing that you would call when you're processing the form to make sure that it's there. It's a little bit easier if you're using Z3C Form. As of the end of January, we added this. So you just say enable CSRF protection equals true, and it'll take care of doing that for you on the form. We should probably make this be the default at some point, but we need to think about whether that'll break anything else, so it hasn't happened yet. Another common problem is character encodings. If you're making custom forms, make sure that you test them out and put in some funny non-ASCII characters, because that's a really common thing that doesn't get caught until it's in production and, you know, somebody is trying to enter their Norwegian name that has a, you know, one of those O with a slash through it or whatever. There's a couple ways you can take care of this. If you're using FormLib or Z3C Form, they already take care of this for you. They'll, the values coming in the request are UTF-8 encoded. It'll automatically decode them to Unicode. If you're doing your own processing, then when you get a value from the form, from the request, you can decode it as UTF-8 there in Python, and that'll prevent it from breaking. Or you can deal with it when you write your template by adding this :UTF-8 :U string. And basically, that's a clue to Zope that when it is reading in the request, it should take that name and convert it to Unicode, and then just use the name and throw away the stuff with the colons. It's a feature of Zope called request marshalling that is a little bit lesser known. And then another final caveat is dealing with database conflicts. The way the Zope publisher works is, if you're writing things to the database, it'll commit the transaction. And if somebody else was writing to the same object at the same time, you'll get a conflict error. And Zope says, okay, well, we're just writing to the database in Zope, and that's fine, so I'll just try running the request again. So it processes the full request again and hopefully doesn't hit a conflict that time. And a lot of times that works out. But if your form is doing, if your action is doing something like sending an email or something else that is not storing things in the ZODB or is not transactional, call out to some third-party web service, then when that retry happens, that's going to happen a second time. And there have been cases I've seen where this was done for credit card processing or something, and somebody ended up getting charged 3 times or something like that. So be careful. The best way to deal with this is if you are doing one of those things that's non-transactional, the ZODB has a feature called an after commit hook. And basically you say add after commit hook, and then you pass in a function that it's supposed to call after the commit is definitely there. And so you can just defer all of your interaction with external systems till after that. That's about all I've got. I think I'm going to call it quits there so that there's time for questions. I just had a couple more slides about the future of forms in Plone, but the future of forms in Plone was mostly about Plone app widgets, which Eric mentioned earlier today, and the effort that Rock Garbus is doing on modernizing our widgets. So that's all I need to say about that. Any questions about forms? I know I was moving pretty fast, so feel free to contact me at some other point too, and I can certainly follow up. If you do have questions, please come to the mic in the middle so that it gets onto the recording.
I heard that somebody brought up the fact that you could use Plone form gen to an adapter, and then there's some script runs, and then go and create another, fill out some default field for event or something,
Yeah,
and
you can.
So that's can you describe a little bit about how that works?
Yeah, Plone form gen has this notion of action adapters, and it basically, you can add a mailer or you can add whatever one you want. One of the ones you can add is a custom script adapter, and so you can have whatever Python code that you want in there to do whatever you want. The disadvantage to that is that I think it's restricted Python, so you're not going to be able to do everything, only the things that are allowed and through the web code. So you might be better off configuring the Plone form gen form to submit to a Zope browser view where you have full access to the power of Python. But yeah, it's possible to write whatever code that creates whatever thing you want. What's that? Oh yeah, I think I mentioned the product that Nathan wrote creates content items off of a Plone form gen submission. That's called uw.pfg.d2c. And you can blame Nathan for that. What does D2C stand for even? So yeah, University of Washington dot cloneformgen dot data to content is the mnemonic. I'm from Seattle, Wisconsin. Any other questions? Well, thank you, and have a good evening.